I think the place to start is by introducing a concept called the demographic transition. The demographic transition is the shift from high mortality and high fertility to low mortality and low fertility that inevitably accompanies development and modernization. It's a transition that China's gone through and that much of the rest of the emerging world is going through now. The transition ordinarily begins with a decline, sometimes a precipitous decline, in infant and child mortality. This happened in China starting in the 1960s. You have a precipitous decline in infant and child mortality. It triggers rapid population growth. Then with a lag, people realize that they no longer need to have 5, 6, or 7 children in order to achieve their targeted family size, and the birth rate falls. That happened in China as well, beginning in the 1970s. It's happened in most parts of the emerging world. In China, it was given an extra push, of course, by the one-child policy. So as the demographic transition unfolds, it becomes a spur to development. First of all, you have fewer children, and you don't yet have an increase in the elderly population. So you get a large surge in the midlife share of the population. The share of China's population in the traditional working years, 20 to 64, has increased from 45% to 65% since the mid-1970s. That alone pushes up per capita income. You have more producers relative to dependent consumers, as it were. But there are also a series of knock-on effects. You have fewer children to take care of, you free up adult time, and especially the time of women for participation in the market economy. You have more of the population aging into their 30s and 40s. You can get a big increase in savings. And finally, declining family size together with rising life expectancy greatly increases incentives to invest in human capital, in the quality of children and hence of the future workforce rather than in the quantity. So rising life expectancy is both a cause and a consequence of development. In Russia, where since the fall of the Soviet Union, male life expectancy has collapsed, investment in human capital has collapsed as well. In China, rising life expectancy is pushing investment in human capital in the opposite direction, upward. Improvements in medicine, as China brings its investment in the healthcare sector of the economy up to developed world levels over time. And along with investment in medical technology, also improving access to healthcare. So that's on the positive side, number one. Number two, the ongoing development itself and the continued mass migration from the countryside to the city should also boost life expectancy. You have a fairly wide range in life expectancy today, or gap in life expectancy rather, between rural and urban China. On average, China is 75 now for male-female life expectancy combined. But in some of the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, it's closer to 80. So on the positive side, you have two big drivers. First, there's the increasing sophistication of medical care in China as the government brings its investment in the healthcare sector up to developed world levels. Secondly, there's the continued ongoing migration from rural to urban China. There are big disparities in life expectancy across China today. On average, life expectancy at birth for Men and women combined is 75. In the countryside, it's lower. In big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, life expectancy approaches 80. So both of those will continue to push life expectancy up. On the other hand, there are a couple of forces at work which could potentially push life expectancy in the other direction. Development is wonderful. Rising incomes and affluence allows people to escape poverty, to fulfill hopes and dreams that they otherwise couldn't possibly hope to achieve. But it also brings along with it the plague of chronic diseases. As China becomes more affluent, they'll consume more meat. As China becomes more affluent, the population will consume more processed carbohydrates. The United States, leading the way in the developed world, the developed world is now suffering from a growing obesity epidemic with the attendant associated health problems of diabetes, hypertension, etc. That may be in China's future as well. Then there is a second factor, and that's that the generation in midlife now, some people call them in late midlife, the generation in their 50s and 60s, the so-called Red Guard generation, has a particularly poor health profile relative both to older and younger adults. This is the generation that was sent out to the countryside to be re-educated during the Cultural Revolution. According to some indicators, their health profile is significantly worse than either their seniors or their juniors. There's an analogous problem in the United States. In the United States, the rates of rates of disability among the elderly have been declining for decades. But some demographers predict that that will be reduced as boomers begin to cross the threshold into old age. Boomers led the way on obesity, they led the way on substance abuse, and they're taking all of those habits with them into their so-called golden years. So we could potentially see a countervailing force on the basic drivers increasing life expectancy in China as the Red Guard generation retires. Well, first of all, let's talk for just a moment about the negative impact. Demographics have been leaning strongly with economic growth in China for the past 3 decades. The demographic transition creates a demographic dividend that helps to push up per capita income and per capita wealth. Some economists estimate that the changing age structure and growth rate of China's population since the mid-1970s actually accounts for between 1/3 and 2/5 of the increase in living standards. The share of the population in the traditional working years has been rising from 45% in 1975 to 65% today, but all of that is going to be thrown into reverse. The first thing that happens when you have fewer children is that you have fewer children to take care of, and a rising share of the population in the working years. But eventually the other foot falls, and the steeper fertility's declined, the more massive an age wave you'll have. So the favorable demographics that have been leaning with economic growth are beginning to lean against growth in China. Rising life expectancy is an important part of that. The longer people live, and particularly at the very oldest ages in the 70s and 80s, the more burden you have on the social insurance programs and the social safety net. But rising life expectancy has to be seen in the context of low fertility as well. And it's the two together that are driving this, that are driving the aging of China over the next decade or two. Economic growth, which has already begun to slow, will slow further as the growth rate of the working age population falls to zero, and the working age population begins to contract. Fiscal burdens from pension and healthcare programs will rise. All of this threatens the twin pillars of the current regime's legitimacy. Okay. The deal has been political acquiescence in return for rapid economic growth and social stability. But population aging, driven in part by rising life expectancy, strikes directly at both of those premises. It will slow economic growth, and it will also add another multiplier on top of all of the social and economic stresses, from rural to urban migration to environmental degradation that China is currently trying to cope with. In a sense, the government said to the Chinese people, you can only have one child now, but we'll take care of you when you get old. So the government, the part of that implicit deal is that the government will substitute for the family. And a survey I recently did in China shows that, unlike in other East Asian countries, in most other East Asian countries, there is an overwhelming expectation of government support for older people and for retirees. So the government needs to come through on that, and it's aware, completely aware of the magnitude of the challenge, which is why, or one of the reasons why, it has been moving so rapidly to expand the pension system and to shore up the social safety net. If it doesn't, it will find itself facing a future of increasing social unrest.